Hey everyone, welcome. We're going to give it a minute as folks join. We'll start the program shortly. Hey everyone who's joining. This is Mark Hefflinger with Pipeline Fighters Hub and Bold Alliance. We are going to give it a minute or two as folks are joining. Thanks for tuning in. Hey folks, thanks for joining. Just a reminder, we are going to wait a couple minutes as folks are logging on to the Zoom here before we start the program. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Mark Hefflinger. I go by he, him pronouns. Whoops, hold on here. And I am the Digital and Communications Director for the Bold Alliance, which includes Bold, Nebraska, and the newly launched Pipeline Fighters Hub, which we created to serve as an online and in real life resource hub to provide expertise to the wider networks of water protectors and pipeline fighters who are organizing locally to stop pipelines and other risky fossil fuel projects in their communities. So we've got a website, pipelinefighters.org. It's got an outline of most of the larger pipeline fights that are going on right now, with links to engage with the grassroots and frontline organizers. There's a lot of resources on fighting eminent domain or organizing to enact county and city level resolutions to protect your water supplies. As part of the hub, I also publish a free daily email newsletter called Extracted that you can subscribe to, which has all the most important news about all the various pipeline fights, what's happening with pipeline related legislation in Washington on the state level, new research and science about climate and the oil and gas industry, what's happening with folks working to stop the money pipeline and climate finance work, and a roundup of opinion, articles, and op-eds. And that comes out daily in the morning. I will include a link to subscribe in the follow-up to this webinar. We're excited today to announce our second webinar, Briefing the Pipeline Fighters Hub. We launched as another resource, which will be hosted monthly. Today's discussion is on recent pipeline fight victories with grassroots pipeline fighters and organizers who work to defeat big oil and gas projects in their communities, including Keystone XL, Atlantic Coast, Byhalia Connection, Jordan Cove LNG, and huge shout out happened this week. Penn East is now in a canceled column on the Pipeline Fighters Hub website. Amazing work to all the folks up in the Northeast working on that. We're going to be talking about how folks won their fights and key lessons learned, and all the work that all of us are still doing. In case you missed it, the last webinar we did last month was on carbon capture pipelines. There's a recording available of that on our website. There will also be a recording available made of this in case you missed part of it, along with the captioning, which should be happening hopefully. Now for a bit of housekeeping for today's briefing and agenda. We'll introduce the panelists who will talk for about 8 minutes each. We'll have a Q&A segment. So if you click on the Q&A at the bottom of your screen there on Zoom, that's how we'll handle that part of it. You can just type your questions in. If you happen to be on the phone, you can email me a question at mark@boldnebraska.org. To introduce our panelists now, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Jane Klebb. Jane is the president of Bold Alliance and founder of Bold Nebraska, which, in case you're just tuning in, we helped organize an unlikely alliance of farmers, ranchers, tribal nations, and environmental advocates to defeat the Keystone XL pipeline. Jane also is now the chair of the Nebraska Democratic Party. Take it away, Jane.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for helping make sure that all the tech and communication pieces of not only tonight's event, but the entire work that Bold does over the last several years is top-notch. If you don't subscribe yet to Mark's Extracted newsletter, it is a must-read every morning. It's in your inbox, and you get all the news clips in order to stay on top of all the pipeline news. I can't tell you how excited I am tonight to have so many strong frontline organizers who have fought tirelessly to make sure that their voices were heard and that they stopped the pipeline that was threatening not only their land, but also the water and, of course, climate. If you were to tell me 10 years ago that we would be celebrating the victory of Keystone XL along with other pipelines that took on the fight in their local communities, I would have believed you. From day one, I knew that an unlikely alliance of farmers, ranchers, tribes, and climate advocates really could take on Goliath, that it was in our power to take down a pipeline company, if not fundamentally because it was the wrong thing to do. We had no idea what we were doing. And you will hear from the panelists on how we all had to learn as we went. We had to navigate a maze of abbreviations from pipeline companies and state agencies and federal agencies in order to figure out how exactly we could use the levers of citizens in the legal avenue and grassroots organizing and communications and politics in order to stop the pipelines in our communities. We all took different paths, but we shared so many of the same strategies that we are going to share with you all tonight and that we're sharing with pipeline fighters all across the country. I also want to recognize some pipeline fights that are happening right now of our sisters and brothers their pipeline fights, quite frankly, President Biden should be standing up for. We, of course, were thrilled on day one when President Biden decided to use his power of the executive order in his office to reject the Keystone XL pipeline. He has that same power to do the same exact thing that he did for Keystone XL on the Dakota Access pipeline, on line 3, line 5. There's no question that he has the ability to do that, in addition to the Mountain Valley pipeline. Those pipelines can be stopped with the Army Corps and with President Biden. And I am confident the more that we push, the more that will happen. And maybe in politics, they're focused right now on the infrastructure bills. As somebody who's in politics, I get that. But our lives, our water, our land should never be trade-offs to politics and negotiating. So please continue to tweet, continue to message. If you can participate in the people versus fossil fuels that's happening in DC in mid-October, that's going to put all the pressure we can as citizens and as allies to tell President Biden, we know he believes in climate change. We know he said in his own words that the climate crisis is a red alert. So it's now time for us to back up those words with actions. And that absolutely means stopping these pipelines. And it definitely means never allowing carbon pipelines to now threaten our land, water, and our communities. So I'm excited that I get to introduce each of the pipeline fighters and water protectors to everybody listening. And our first presenter is Joye Braun. She is the National Pipelines Campaign Organizer with the Indigenous Environmental Network. You may have seen her co-worker, Dallas Goldtooth, in Res Dogs on Hulu. If you haven't, please watch it. It's hilarious. Joye, when I met Joye, is essentially the second that I was in her presence, I knew that she was going to be a fighter and a protector that was going to be able to help us bring the Keystone XL pipeline over the finish line. And then she took on and was was the first actually person to hold a spirit camp in Standing Rock and really held the ground there and held that space to welcome all the hundreds and thousands of people who then took time to make sure to protect that land and water that unfortunately went through under Donald Trump. And again, President Biden has the ability to stop Dakota Access Pipeline. So with that, let me turn it over to my sister, a fierce advocate. If you're on the wrong side of Joye, you're on the wrong side of me. Take it away, Joye.
Good evening, Jane. Good evening, Mark. And the rest of the panelists here. Holy smokes, we got a lineup tonight. This is going to be good. Ampetu washte, you happy? Chante washte na pe chiuza happy. Wanbli wiakawi imachi happy. My name is Eagle Feather Woman. I'm a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, I'm Dakota, and I reside here on my homelands on the Cheyenne River Sioux in South Dakota. So I greet you all with a hearty handshake tonight. In preparing for tonight, I got to go through a whole bunch of pictures that of the Keystone XL fight and have a lot of really good memories that came up, A lot of hard memories too. Because there were a lot of lessons that happened. Like Jane said, we didn't really know what we were doing. When I first moved back from Washington State, I was in a wheelchair. I'm still in a wheelchair, but again, I got out of it for a while, back in it again. But I didn't really know what I was doing. I saw a grandma stand up to some mega loads down in Wanbli, South Dakota. She just passed away, Marie Randall, Grandma Marie Randall. I saw on Auntie Debbie White Plume saying we needed to stop this Keystone XL pipeline from this Trans-Canada. And I remember hearing about Keystone 1 when I was back in Washington State, but there wasn't a whole lot that I could do. I could write emails. I could make some phone calls. I could send a letter or two, and I did those things. But now I was back home, and I had learned that originally Trans-Canada wanted to go right through my reservation, and we weren't going to have any of that. And they tried to buy us off with Tempur-Pedic beds and generators and other things. And of course, we're not fools. Tempur-Pedic bed is nothing compared to making sure that we have clean water and a clean future for the next 7 generations of our children. So we stood up and we fought. And we had ceremony. And as Indigenous people, we don't go in to do anything unless we go into it with prayer and ceremony and guidance. And that what that does is it builds a community and builds strength among those that are getting ready to stand the line. So my uncles down in Rosebud, my uncles down there, they had ceremony, and and they said that they were going to have some camps. The first camp was down in Nebraska. That was a week long. And the second camp was the Rosebud Spirit Camp down there in Rosebud Sioux Tribe. And then the third camp, people don't know there was a third camp for Keystone XL. This was a frontline camp. That frontline camp was here on the Cheyenne River called Pate-Oshpai. And I was there at that camp. Wasn't very many of us, but we were standing there because the small community of Bridger, South Dakota, was being put at stake. And Bridger had asked us to go at that time. So we went down there, we put up my teepee, and Somehow or other, we survived cold and we survived heat. We even survived a tornado. It wouldn't be the first time I survived a tornado in a teepee. My second time was up at Sacred Stone, but that's another pipeline fight. That's DAPL. But there were a lot of lessons that we had to learn, both as Indigenous people and as non-Native people. When we first got into this fight, the Indigenous voice at the table of these environmental justice movements was almost nil. It was almost impossible to even be considered equal. It's still hard today, but at least we get to have a say and say, hey, we need to be at that table. But at the very beginning, it was really hard. And I give a lot of credit to Tom Goldtooth and some of our other EJ leaders to make sure that the Indigenous voice was at least being considered. How many times do you go on Zoom meetings and you hear this so-called land acknowledgement? Now, it shouldn't stop at land acknowledgement, but I can tell you, even getting a meeting to acknowledge whose land we are on did not happen. And that, as far as the EJ movement goes, we cannot start to even have healing until we start acknowledging whose land we are truly on. Once we recognized whose land we were on, we could start building friendships. And I called up Art the other day and we were visiting and we were laughing about who would have thunk that I would be calling down to a Nebraska farmer and have true friends. Because for anybody who knows the Midwest, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Eastern Montana, parts of Minnesota, most of Minnesota, any place like that, anywhere you're anywhere near larger Indigenous populations, you're going to find a whole lot of racism. And a lot of that is based in fear, and a lot of that is based in ignorance. But we had to break down those barriers of ignorance and realize that we were just people who had the same dreams as everybody else. We wanted the dream to have clean water. We wanted the dream to make sure our land was not poisoned. We wanted to make sure that our children had a future, because all of us love this land. All of us care about the water, and all of us care about our grandchildren. And so there were a lot of things that happened along the way, and a lot of tears were spilled, and sometimes words of anger were spoken. But like anything worth absolutely having and believing in, you work through those things. You work through those things. If you truly believe in what you're working for. And I truly believe in having clean water and clean land and clean air. And I've always believed in building friendships. So I'm so ever grateful that I was able to build those friendships. And you know, it was the Keystone XL fight that laid the foundation for the Dakota Access pipeline fight. And without those connections that we had built with KXL, I could not have called on all the people that we called on to help fight DAPL. And remember, we're still fighting DAPL. But I'm so glad that I got to have lifetime friends with Jane and with Art. And Jane, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Joy. One of the things that was amazing about the friendships and alliance that the Cowboy and Indian, alliance that we resurrected in South Dakota with grandmother Faith Spotted Eagle, who told us that story, and so many of the elders that were at that meeting, one of the first meetings we had together, told us the story on how the farmers, ranchers, and tribes all got together to stop the uranium mining in South Dakota and called themselves the Cowboy and Indian Alliance, which is how we resurrected and honored that name together. But one of the biggest lessons that I learned from you and from Faith was that, yes, we needed to know the history of racism. And we did a lot of that in with flip charts and of course in meetings about that and the theories behind that. But the most important thing that made the alliance strong, so we always had each other's back, so big oil and the Republicans couldn't divide us, was the actions we did together. That built trust no matter what. And so I want to just acknowledge that and thank you. And it's a perfect actually transition to Art, because so many of the actions that we did were on the land that Art and Helen care for so much, and that they then eventually, through years of work with the Ponca Sacred Corn, have now deeded some of that land back to the rightful owners and caretakers of that land, the Ponca tribe of Nebraska and Oklahoma. Art is a farmer in Antelope County in Neely. When we first started, there were no windmills around Art's property. Now there's lots. You're really beginning to see the clean energy transition. Art is a former teacher, full-time farmer, and also got elected to the NRD board. So he's also now responsible for clean water as an elected official, which is pretty great. Art's also the proud farmer and owner of a piece of land that held the largest concert in the state of Nebraska in a cornfield with Neil Young, Willie Nelson, Lucas Nelson, Frank Walm, and so many others. So with that, I'll turn it over to one of the best farmers and heroes we know, Art Tanderup. Oh, and crop artist. I should have said that, but hopefully, Art, you're going to show us a crop art.
Thank you, Jane. Greetings to everyone from the Pipeline Fighter Village in the heart of Ponca land. Go ahead, Mark, with a slide here, and we'll get started with some slides and talk about a bunch of things here. So, the good old Keystone XL pipeline, and as Jane and Joye have both mentioned, you know, alliances killed this black snake. Okay, next. Okay, and there's Sister Joye and myself at a hearing. And we've, as Joye said, we've developed a great relationship. And, you know, if it had not been for Keystone XL, I would have never known Joye and so many other great people. Okay. Okay, the Keystone XL was to run from Canada to Steel City, Nebraska, going through treaty lands and sacred sites, across rivers, streams, and wetlands, over and through the Ogallala Aquifer, raping the land, destroying treaty and property rights. Okay, it's a long war. We had many battles, over 10 years. And here we had a powerful foreign corporation against us. We had state and federal politicians against us, court systems against us, neighbors and communities against us, but we knew we were on the right side of what was good for everyone. And with this battle, it you know, like everybody said so far, a lot, you know, mistakes were made, but we did a lot of things right. And I think one of the neatest things that we did is Jane was very creative, as well as some of the other leaders, and the key was getting that grassroots involvement, getting the stakeholders, the landowners on board early in the battle. And then we built those alliances like the Cowboy Indian alliances, and you know, with the environmental groups, with all the people that were in this fight with us. And we had to frame those common issues that brought us all together, because this group of people, you talk about so many things, and we are on, you know, all sides of everything else, but on this issue, we're together. So we had those strong leaders, and they worked as a team, and they worked with us. They helped build those relationships and strong bonds. just like now I call Joye a sister. I call Jane a sister. Well, actually, Jane's about the age of my daughter, so she's kind of like both. And we had to have great legal teams to represent landowners, and that happened in Nebraska as well as up in South Dakota and other places. We were constantly educating everyone. That is something that is a key ingredient. If you want to convince people that you're doing the right thing, you have to give them an education, because when we started out on this thing, none of us knew what the heck tar sands were. And so the continual battle where we engaged and activated people, that very significant. Keep engaging and keep activating and keep those voices speaking the issues and telling the stories. So it's not something that people forget about. We're in the face of those government officials, of those all the people that are saying no to us, all the people that are saying yes to the pipeline. We're trying to educate them, and if not, at least make them feel a little bit guilty. Okay, this was kind of our first project, besides the meetings and all that sort of thing. We built a clean energy barn in the path of the Keystone XL pipeline. It would have run right underneath that barn. So that was, and you notice we built signs, we brought people together, we worked really hard, and we built this thing. Okay. As was said earlier, we had the first of the spirit camps here on our farm right here, and it was a short one, but it was very powerful because it's located on the Ponca Trail of Tears. Next. And we also went up to South Dakota to help the Rosebud in with their spirit camp and their many celebrations and days of getting together, etc. Okay, and then we created a little crop art on our farm. This is the north half of my farm. This is an 80-acre crop art, and it features the Cowboy Indian Alliance symbol, and of course a great message. And this went worldwide, and I could spend an hour just talking about this image, but it's been very powerful over the years. And I will point out one thing that we did is with this image, you'll see it in other places, the cowboy and Indian are reversed. And I asked the artist John Quigley if we could turn this around so that the Native American could be overlooking the Ponca Trail of Tears, because the Ponca Trail of Tears is on the east side of our farm. Okay, next. Okay, and then shortly after that, we went to Washington, D.C. and participated in the Reject and Protect week-long events, and making, on the National Mall there, making our voices heard in Washington, D.C. Next. Okay, we also participated in the Climate March in New York City. And here we are with our Rosebud relatives marching strong, and we stayed together that whole Climate March down through many blocks of concrete in New York City. Okay, this is something at that spirit camp, a gentleman by the name of Mikasi Hornick, we talked, and he said, I would love to bring our sacred corn back to its homeland. We haven't grown our sacred corn, and it's such an important part of us. So to make a long story short, he found some 137-year-old seed, and we planted it that next spring. We planted 4 acres of corn there, and that 137-year-old seed grew. And I was the skeptic and thought it would not. But this has been a powerful thing that we've done every year. As a matter of fact, in a couple of weeks, we'll be picking our 8th crop of this. Okay. And as Jane mentioned, we had the largest concert in a cornfield in Nebraska. And with more population than in the county that I live in. And even though that particular county tried to shut us down, we still were able to, we worked on that and were able to hold a beautiful event that lasted all day long. And we educated thousands of people that day. Next. Okay, this is our second crop art to President Obama, a direct message, and, you know, to act on climate as he said he would. Okay. We also did things like carving pumpkins, you know, getting people together, activating them, and also, you know, getting some press and keeping this pipeline issue out there on the front pages of newspapers and TV and radio programs. Next. Okay, we also installed solar, what we call Solar XL, right in the path of the pipeline. This particular installation is just a few miles from the South Dakota border. And as with other things, it sits right over the top where they wanted to put that pipeline. And just a few hundred feet from where this sits is a native village, or the remains of a native village that they would have plowed right through. Very sacred grounds, and probably many burial sites. Next. Okay, this is picking how, you know, we hand plant that corn, we hand pick it, and this is one of the pickings that we did. This corn has been you know, planted all over the country and in many paths of many pipelines. This corn is powerful. The State Department, in the last EIS that they wrote on Keystone, basically told TransCanada, hey guys, you better go around this field of corn because it's on sacred ground and it is sacred. And as I think we'll see in one of the next slides here, this is on ground that the Ponca own. We also built a medicine wheel where we have ceremonies when we pick and plant, and people come at other times as well. Okay, next. And this is, my wife and I decided that we would donate land back to the Ponca. This was their land. Our ancestors took it from them. That was wrong, and we need to give some of it back. So we donated like 10 acres of land to them. Part of this is on the Ponca Trail of Tears, and it is directly in the path of the Keystone XL pipeline. And like I said, that's you know, they did reroute, TransCanada did reroute it around our farm, you know, which made me happy, but it didn't make me happy because I know if that thing was built and it leaked, rather than drinking water, the water that would kill me the first day, it would be 2 or 3 days later. Okay, next. Okay, and this is the last of the Keystone crop arts that we did, We the People, and Jane insisted that we use the calligraphy for We the People, and the artist and I didn't know whether that would happen, but as you can see, it's a beautiful piece. So we sent this message to Mr. Trump, okay, and we also helped elect a new president. He understands the climate crisis. He killed KXL, and without each and every one of us, this would not have happened. Next. Okay, the black snake is dead, you know, but we have carbon pipelines threatening the Midwest, Line 3, MVP, and the list goes on and on and on. Next. So what can we do? We got to stay involved. We got to help each other out in these pipeline battles. And probably one of the things we have to do so that the right decisions are made, we have to elect responsible decision makers. We have to run for office, encourage others to run for office. And yes, get out there and vote, and drag everyone you know to get out there and vote. Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Art. It's been obviously an honor to be shoulder to shoulder with you over the decade of fighting Keystone XL. And the beautiful thing about the Ponca Sacred Corn is that it really did create this force field around the land. And we intentionally knew that as a strategy, and other pipeline fights have planted the corn as medicine in the land. But it is a strategy that I hope other pipeline fights deploy to really use tools like, for us, it was the Ponca Sacred Corn. For other communities, it may be other things, but that gives legal grounding in a legal case for the courts to the tribes and to the landowner to essentially say, no, you don't get to cross this land because this is a treaty land, a sacred cultural resource of the tribes. So I want to thank you for that. Next up is Justin Pearson. I got to be with Justin Pearson a couple weeks ago down in Memphis, Tennessee. What an amazing spirit that Justin has in the fight that they are doing with Memphis communities against pipelines. I think sometimes people believe that pipelines are only threatening kind of rural white communities and Native Americans. And the reality is pipelines threaten all communities, all races. But they target communities that they think don't have power. And so the community that they were going through, Justin's community, they quickly realized that actually, in fact, the Black community is very powerful and is not going to let a pipeline corporation take their land. So Byhalia is now bye-bye Byhalia. So with that, I will turn the mic over to Justin.
Jane, thank you so much, and to Bold Alliance, to everyone who's spending the time here to participate. Thank you. I'll start with this because I saw a note from Katie in the chat that is worth thinking about. And I'm a son of a Black preacher, and so I could go for forever, but Mark's told me I have 8 minutes, which I'm going to treat as 5, so that I stick to time. The news about Line 3. For those of us in the struggle and fight for justice is quite difficult. And the story that I'll share just to kick this off is I remember watching the fight at Standing Rock before I was involved in the environmental justice work or movement, before I knew much about people fighting pipelines. I didn't know networks like this even existed 12 months ago. And I remember witnessing sort of the perpetuation of systemic harm and injustice against Indigenous communities, most particularly then ancestral lands, the risk to water. And even, I think, even when we do not win outrightly, when some of these projects still seem to go forward, that there is something that we create that is quite powerful, that the spirit of the people who have invested the time and the energy and the fight for justice matters. And it will be pushed forward for the next fight. And I was thinking of what Joye said there, that, the foundations have been laid by people who were doing the fight previously. For Byhalia Connection pipeline, it's the folks who were fighting Keystone, it's the folks fighting DAPL that allowed us the opportunity to be some steps ahead. And so, and when thinking about this fight against Line 3, and other ones that we will face, these are foundations for the struggle that we are in, but that I believe collectively we will win. I'm Justin J. Pearson. I serve as the co-founder of Memphis Community Against the Pipeline in Memphis, Tennessee. And we together fought and beat 2 multi-billion-dollar corporations, Valero Energy Corporation and Plains All Americans Byhalia Connection pipeline. And it's important to know what this project was about. They said our community was the path of least resistance. That's what they called the community. In quotes, Wyatt Price, he said this. They decided they were going to build a crude oil pipeline through Memphis, connected to Mississippi, and send it down to Louisiana, St. James, Louisiana, which is the same place, as many of you know, known as Cancer Alley, because of how many petrochemical plants and oil refineries are there. And so this was a perpetuation of environmental racism, environmental injustice that I now understand a little bit better, but our communities, Black communities, Indigenous communities, communities of color, and communities that are lower wealth know all too common. In Memphis, they were not only just planning to build through the path of least resistance as they believed, but it was atop the most seismically active area east of California. They were going to build atop the Memphis sand aquifer, which supplies over 1 million people their drinking water. And they were building it through Boxtown, a community founded in the 1860s by freed Black folk who had been enslaved for centuries. They called it the path of least resistance because they believed that the community that has been historically disempowered, the community that has been historically marginalized and excluded, would not fight back. And this is the thing about our community and communities that are in this struggle and in this fight. We'll always fight back because we too believe that clean air and clean water and clean land, as Joye said earlier, matter. And so even when they thought that the deal had been done, because they've been working on it for 2 years, they had spent money in the community to buy people off. They had paid for organizations like the NAACP to have $25,000 here and there. There's a lot that have been done already, but they met us in October of last year, explaining to us how good this project was, and the community resisted. We said, not anymore. And this is in the wake of the lynchings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, where we're understanding the intersectionality of Black identity and the sufferings that are going on. A global pandemic that attacks the lungs. People with COPD and asthma having significant side effects from the virus. And those communities that are suffering the most are also the communities that are most polluted. And so these intersections mattered. Because in Southwest Memphis, there are 17 toxic release inventory facilities, including an oil refinery and including a steel plant. In Southwest Memphis, the cancer rate is 4 times higher than the national average. These corporations are using exploitation that already exists to persist on the injustices. And it will be when they run up against people like y'all and people like us, where change and justice truly happens. And so how we win and how we fight together everywhere, it makes a difference. And for us, we needed to inform and educate and activate the community. A lot of people didn't know what was going on. And so we hit the streets. We started knocking on doors, letting people know there's this crude oil pipeline company that's coming and they're going to destroy our water and they're going to take people's land, right? We had to inform people and we had to educate even our city council who thought this was a done deal and they had no responsibility or role. And we had to organize and galvanize people for the cause of justice using what was universal. And that's what I love about the work done with Keystone XL that was illuminated here, that there's a lot of things that are connecting us in these fights. Most notably, our water, our desire to live healthy and in safe communities. So we galvanized our community resources, Boxtown Neighborhood Association, Westwood Neighborhood Association, Alcee Ball Neighborhood Association, centering voices of people who have been historically marginalized and connecting with other organizations that care about the environment and care about environmental justice, such as the Southern Environmental Law Center and Protect Our Aquifer, some of the local groups here, Breach Collective, based out of Portland, but chose a social location with folks in Memphis to build a coalition that was diverse and pluralistic in order that we might fight back. Now, I ain't never fought a pipeline before, Jane. I had a whole lot of learning to do in the process, and learn definitely did happen. And some of the things we learned is that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has a permit that they're using or allowing pipeline companies to use that are running through communities. Our state level agencies are permitting projects that they know have disproportionate harm in violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And eminent domain is being misused in places. And so it is going to be a combination of both legal and sustained public advocacy that helps to change this. And I believe that we can win. And I believe that because if we center those who are most excluded and bring them from the margins into the center of conversations and policy making, it makes a difference. In Memphis, we're pushing legislation. And I thank folks who submitted petitions and signed and emailed our city council and our local leaders, because when we create just laws, we get closer to justice. And this is the fight. And so I remain hopeful and hope-filled by this group of people and by this opportunity, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Justin. It's a perfect segue, actually, when you bring up eminent domain. One of the strongest tools in all of our pipeline fights were the folks who would be directly impacted with a pipeline easement forever across their land really fought the very bad eminent domain for private gain laws all across our state, as well as at the federal level. And that's where Richard Averitt comes in. Richard fought the Atlantic Coast Pipeline for 6 years. And while so many of us were focused and all the media attention was focused on the tar sands pipelines, specifically Keystone XL, fracked gas corporations were knocking on the doors of folks in Virginia, West Virginia, North Carolina, to shove through a massive fracked gas pipeline bigger than we had seen before. Nobody gave Richard and the landowners in Virginia a hope or a prayer, because it wasn't just a normal pipeline company, it was Duke Energy. They essentially hold the grips of power in the state of Virginia, both in the Democratic and Republican Party. So I can't wait to hear from Richard, share his story on how they exactly did it and what's up next for their community. I'll turn it over to you, Richard.
Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you, Mark, and thank you each and every one of you who's here to listen to this tonight. I have to tell you, I'm humbled by the first three speakers. It's very hard to follow Joye and Art and Justin and what they've already brought to the table. And so much of what I want to say, they've covered in many ways. So I'm going to go off script a little bit here and just share some experience. First, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline was a 600-mile pipeline with two heavy hitter energy companies in the Southeast. Duke Energy, who's very powerful in North Carolina, where the pipeline would end in Robeson County, and Dominion Energy, who more or less owns Virginia government, based out of Richmond, Virginia. And so I would say that more specifically in my case, being a Virginia landowner, it was Dominion who I was most uniquely up against. But the project started in Harrison County, West Virginia, from the Marcellus and Utica Shale regions. It ran 600 miles all the way down to Robeson County, North Carolina. And in many ways, it was clear from the outset that the real reason for this pipeline was an acceleration of natural gas, getting it down towards the East Coast. And while maybe some of this gas itself was going to supplant other gas for the region, it was increasing the overall load that could be exported. There was no doubt about that. The precedent agreements by which the government chooses to define need, 5 of the 6 of those agreements that subscribed to the gas from this pipeline were from subsidiaries of Dominion and Duke, created for the sole purpose of buying the gas from the developing project they were doing. So that it was a house of cards from the outset. And I think I want to back up for a minute, though. I want to very much thank Jane for the work that she did along the way to help get me up to speed, but also more importantly for me, I want to thank Joye. We first learned that our personal property in our community was on the path of this proposed pipeline in 2014, and then in 2015 explicitly to our property. And of course, in 2016, we saw so much of what was going on at DAPL. And I feel like Standing Rock is the reason we existed. It's the reason we knew to fight. It's the reason and Keystone as well, but really sort of, Keystone, as Joye said, Standing Rock was built on top of Keystone, and Standing Rock created such extraordinary national awareness around the scale of this problem. And what we watched was, in many ways, those in our society who we would otherwise describe as the least of these, our Native American brothers and sisters, with the least possible resources and the least possible influence, say, hell no, you're not coming here. And put their lives and bodies and voices on the line in a way we just haven't seen before. And in many ways, the strength of that, and I actually reached out, I was lucky enough to build some relationships with Londi Keepseagle and Chase Iron Eyes and others in that process. And I learned from them what it meant to take a stand for the land. And I will say that I came to this fight. In many ways, if you look at me, I'm sort of a symptom of how we got here, relatively privileged white American male fighting for property rights. But even the notion of property rights shifted so much for us in the course of this experience. where you recognize that there are two ways of looking at property rights. One is a sort of exploitative way of saying, this is my land and I'll make as much money and profit as I can off of it. And we certainly see lots of examples of that. And then there are folks like Joye and like Art and others who say, this is my property and it is my obligation to be a steward of it moving forward. And for me, as I look at what happened across the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, is that we built a coalition of unlikely allies, much like Jane has said, cowboys and Indians, in our case, conservatives and liberals and Native Americans and others, who all set all of those things aside to say what we care about is this place. And we don't care about it because we want to make whatever money we can out of it. We care about it because we want to see that it persists in this way to future generations, because it's our lifeblood, and that was really I think to me, that was the thing that was so powerful. And when I heard Justin talk about Boxtown was our Union Hill. I know Chad, Oba and Maple, I saw comments come up in our community or on this, and I know Justin came to the MVP at least to talk there. And we have the same paradigms playing out over and over. And in many ways, it is the fact that that people like me lived for 40 plus years of our lives completely unaware of the injustice being done every day to the communities in my proximity who didn't have the opportunity and resources that I had to put on the line and fight. And so what happened at the ACP? I mean, it was an extraordinary coalition of people who really did three things. We said, we're going to put aside our differences and fight against a common enemy and for a common goal. More importantly, not just against something, but for something, for a future that we saw and believed in, right? To protect this place in its way, in the ways that we want. We then allowed everyone to find their zone of genius, to sort of say, this is the thing that I'm good at, and I'll do that thing. And I won't be able to do all of the things, but I'll do the thing that I'm great at and allow me that space. And we watched really, we had folks who had experience in environmental issues lean into the pipeline coatings and really technical details and fight them at a very specific level, which gave the lawyers the opportunities to launch new arguments. We had folks who said, okay, now that we've stalled because tree sitters have delayed things, we can go validate that the rusty patch bumblebee and the candy darter and actually are here. And we know they're here because we've seen them. We just have to give you the evidence to prove it. And once they provided the evidence, that elevated up to the lawyers who were able to launch an argument. We had the grannies who actually every Wednesday for 6 years without a property on the line picketed in front of Dominion. And what that meant was there was never a week that we weren't in the news. There was never a week when the community could forget that parts of our community were under assault. And so when I look back at the whole thing, I was loud and obnoxious as I can be, and I was constantly ranting in Washington or on the news or whatever. But the real heroes of this are the folks who didn't have this is a hard thing to say because I like to say they didn't have skin in the game, but that's never true. We all have skin in the game at a societal level. That we all have skin in this game for every pipeline fight happening, but who didn't have a specific existential crisis like our family, where your property, your homestead, the thing you had spent years putting together was at stake. Those people who showed up day after day after day and did the part that they could do to contribute, that was the most remarkable thing. Those people are the heroes, to all of us. And what it shows to me is that people say, what did it take to win? It took all of these things. Actually, interestingly, today, Larry Shapiro from the Rockefeller Center had a little op-ed in the Houston Chronicle that sort of encapsulates this in just a few words, right? And it was more or less saying, hey, what does it take to win? It takes getting into the fight early and building a broad coalition of allies. 100%. I can back that up. I believe without that, we'd have never beat the ACP. It believes fighting anywhere and everywhere you can. There is this interesting thing that I don't think we realize. We talked about it on our pipeline. The ACP is death by 1,000 cuts. And it wasn't an explicit strategy. It was more like what we realized was by fighting on all of the things, you create the space and opportunity to find the thing that is the straw that breaks the camel back, the thing that wins, right? And maybe the last one that's really critical, it's actually now tattooed on my arm. If you don't quit, they can't win, right? This is my present to myself after beating the pipeline, but it was never give up, right? As Jane said, she knew when she got in the fight, you could win. And I knew intellectually when we started this, the odds were so steeply stacked against us. But we also knew that someday someone, some community would stop one of these projects. So why not here? Why not now? Right? And what we've seen is we're stopping them over and over again, not dozens of times, but several times already. Penn East, right? Byhalia, Constitution, the ACP. DAPL is now, still up for grabs, right? The tide is turning for all of us, but it takes an extraordinary effort, and I don't discount that at all. It takes us all standing on the shoulders of Joye and others who built a platform that helps us understand what's at stake and what it looks like to stand up for each other. And I think the last thing is we have an obligation. I think the thing that really hit me is when FERC started talking about this Citizens Advisory Committee and all this stuff, which has the risk of being just fluff, right? Just sort of appeasing the beast so they think they can get beyond it and not have to deal anymore from a political perspective. But really, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is acting on behalf of every American citizen when they make a decision that a project is in the public interest or public need, right? We're the public. And so what we have to say is, if we as citizens don't agree that the decision they've made is worth taking the land, putting the water at risk, putting communities at risk, doing all of the terrible things, if the sacrifices are far too great, then we need to recognize that they're doing it on our behalf, which means it's our job as citizens to stand up for all of the people who don't have the opportunity to stand up for themselves and fight like hell, not just to beat the project, but to change the system that makes it possible from the beginning. And so we've got to stay in this till we fix the Natural Gas Act, till we fix the laws, till we elect. And Jane, I will say this with all due respect, because I'm so excited about your role in the Democratic Party. There are many fabulous Democrats. There are also many not so fabulous Democrats. In Virginia, it was 2 Democratic governors back to back who gave us the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, who sold us out. And the one who started it is now likely to win again. And so we need to be standing up, not for parties, but for individuals who will walk the walk, right? And who will stand by the citizens and not the corporations that make this stuff possible. So thank you for having me here. Thank you all for listening. Thank you, Joye, so much for the leadership that you and the Native American community showed each of us what it looks like to fight for the things that matter.
Thank you, Richard. We should have a little photo gallery of people, pipeline fighters and water protectors who get tattoos. I have one on my arm. I know many others do as well, marking that moment in our shared history. I think Joye has one too. Yeah, we definitely need to get that together. I do just want to mention too that Richard and his wife, and he gave full credit to his wife, is working on a landowner guide with the another property rights group, and that is going to come out, I think, within the next couple of months. It's going to be kind of a shared collective of lessons learned, and so it's going to be a huge asset to other groups and other folks who are fighting pipelines. So I want to thank Richard for that. And yeah, you know what, like the Democrats on many levels have got to start living their words that they believe in climate change, because you can't believe in climate change and then turn around and approve pipelines. It just doesn't make any sense. And that means making politicians feel uncomfortable, which is what I absolutely loved about ACP. There were people in middle, upper class, as well as folks who were struggling, day-to-day life, but they kept the feet to the fire of politicians and made them uncomfortable, which I thought was critical in your guys' fight with your county by county organizing. So thank you, Richard. Up next is Allie, and she'll be our last speaker before we turn the mic over to a funder called the Equation Campaign that has actually been critical in the fight against pipelines. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But Allie is with Rogue Climate. And when I first heard their name, I was like, what a kick-ass name for a group. I thought it was just an adjective, like bold is just an adjective. It's not an acronym. And then I, put two and two together, of course, with Rogue in Oregon. They are fighting the Jordan Cove pipeline as well as the LNG terminal. So they had not only a pipeline to fight, but an export terminal as well. Allie also brought together a lot of folks who were both liberal, conservative, environmental activists, and of course, our Native allies in bringing together an unlikely alliance as well. So I'm really excited to hear Allie, who the final nail in the coffin, I think, is coming very soon. So she'll give us an update on that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jane. And thank you everybody who has gone before me. I feel so honored to be here and to be able to speak in this space with you all. And like many have said, so much of the work to stop pipelines is so communal. And even though we're on other sides of the country, other sides of this continent, there's so much work that I know that Joye and Art and Richard and Justin and Jane did that I know helped our community in our fight to stop Jordan Cove LNG and the Pacific Connector frac gas pipeline. Like Jane said, we are not quite done with Jordan Cove LNG yet, but we are in a really good place. And it's really exciting after about 17 years of this fight in our communities to see Jordan Cove so on the outs. And we are going to continue to fight to make sure that it is canceled, just like all of these other pipelines that we've heard about today. So for folks who don't know, the Jordan Cove LNG export terminal is a proposed liquefied natural gas export terminal in Coos Bay, which is on the south coast of Oregon. Along with this proposed export terminal is a 230-mile fracked gas pipeline across the southwest corner of Oregon and through hundreds of miles of traditional territory of dozens of tribes, including the Klamath tribes, the Cow Creek Umpqua tribes, and the Coos Lower Umpqua and Siuslaw tribes, who have all been involved in litigation to protect their cultural and natural resources from this pipeline. So yeah, and a big piece of this fight is also that Jordan Cove LNG would have been, if built, the largest source of climate pollution in the state of Oregon. For those of y'all who are not from the state of Oregon, you might have a perception of Oregon as being this like green hippie state where we're doing progressive environmental things all the time. But that is really not the reality of what it's like in the rural part of Oregon, where I live, and where this pipeline and export terminal are proposed for. So so community members have been fighting this project again for almost 20 years. And we are really excited that right now, after years and years of pressure, put on the state agencies, put on our governors, put on our local city councils, so on and so forth, that we are seeing permit denials, and that those permit denials are being upheld by the federal government, and that right now Jordan Cove LNG has no viable path forward. And I say that with so much excitement, and also with the timidness of of the experience that we all had in 2014, I believe, when FERC denied this project for the first time. And when Trump stepped into office, the company immediately reapplied for. So we we are slow to celebrate here in Southern Oregon when it comes to Jordan Cove LNG, because we have had this experience of thinking it was done and learning later on that it's not. So many of the lessons that I learned having the honor of organizing for Road Climate and coordinating the coalition to stop Jordan Cove LNG are many of the same things that folks today have shared. And I'm going to add little pieces into that. But also just noting that, like, this might feel a little repetitive, but I'll try to share it by sharing stories of how we were able to move this forward. So Jane asked me what the top 3 to 5 lessons that I learned fighting Jordan Cove that can be applied to other fights. So I came up with 3. The first is strategy. The second is making process accessible and fun. And the third is meeting people where they're at and building real and authentic relationships, which I think you all have heard a lot about today. So first off with strategy. So when Trump stepped into office, we knew that our best bet to stop Jordan Cove LNG was going to be through the state of Oregon. And so we decided as a coalition of very diverse community members, wide political range, like Jane had mentioned before. We sat down together and we got to the place of we need to pressure Governor Kate Brown and the state of Oregon and our agencies to deny this project and make sure that the state denies every single permit that they can, especially the ones that have preemption over the federal government, like the Clean Water Act, the Coastal Zone Management Act, and some state land provisions, technical wonky stuff. And we had a lot of buy-in to this strategy because we developed it together as a community. People understood that their eyes were on the prize, right? That we were going to have the state deny this project, and even if the federal government was going to try to push it through, we could stop it with the state authority. And so that's what we focused on. And landowners, tribes, tribal members, other community members whose water would be impacted, climate activists, direct action folks, like we all were able to stay centered on this is our goal, and that we respected that people were going to have different tactics to get there and respected that autonomy and knew that that made us stronger, and that with a diversity of tactics, we could actually be way stronger than if one person or one group was deciding what was going to happen when. So I think that was something that I think I would share with other folks fighting pipelines, is that have buy-in and have a shared strategy, but let people decide how we get there, because they know what's best for their communities, and that's the way that we can win. So the next little point was making process accessible and fun. So since so much of our strategy relied on the state agencies denying permits, we put a lot of effort into making comment writing something that everyone felt confident doing and that people actually wanted to show up for. So we would, write guides and templates to help people draft their own comments, but we also held workshops and parties where we highlighted people's lived experiences. We had food, we had music, we had community spaces. We got to know each other, and people showed up and they wrote, tens of thousands of comments to state regulators to tell them why this pipeline and export terminal would have impacted them and done so much harm to their community. And in the end, those stories, those personal stories, are the reasons why the state denied these projects. When we look at the denials that we can see references to when someone was actually writing about the creek in their backyard that salmon spawn in, they see, the incredible comments from all of the tribes on natural resources and cultural resources. We can see that in the denials, that writing those comments and writing them from a place of you don't have to be a technical expert actually really sealed the deal. So yeah, and then the third point that I had here is, you know, meeting people where they're at and building real and authentic relationships. You know, I've been so lucky to be able to spend so much time, not just in Jackson County where I live, but in all 4 of the counties that the pipeline has been proposed through, and staying with people, with landowners, with tribal members, with folks right on the pipeline route, getting to know them, getting to stay in their houses, being invited to their birthday parties, having, you know, monthly meals with them. That work is the most important work that we can do when we're organizing to stop pipelines. It's the seeing people as humans, seeing their humanity, whether or not we agree on everything, leaning into what we do agree on, which is protecting this land that we love, protecting this water that we all rely on, and leaning into that, and learning how we can work together. And I think that is what can make us really, really strong. And solidarity is just so key in all of this. You know, we showed up for communities and things beyond the pipeline too. So when the hearings on dam removal for the Klamath River dams were happening, we showed up with our friends on the Klamath River to speak out against the dams and the impacts that they've had on the Indigenous communities' ability to harvest salmon and have healthy and clean water. You know, when there were, you know, racist, a lot of some like racist remarks that were happening at the Coos County level, we were able to speak up about that, and not just around the pipeline, but around how our community should be, and showing up for folks whenever, because that's what organizing is about. So one story that I just want to share before I finish up is about the Alameda and Obichon fires. So last September, fires in Oregon burned thousands of homes, including 3,000 in Jackson County, where I live, and the Road Climate Office. And when that fire happened, there was also a fire burning on the pipeline route on public lands, just a few miles away. And when that fire happened, the first people who asked what they could do and started organizing supplies and money and support for our communities were people who we had been fighting Jordan Cove with for decades. And sorry, I'm crying because it's really special. And the amount of trucks and vans that folks filled up with the supplies that we needed for our communities to be able to sleep through the night from the pipeline campaign was amazing. And it just showed how much this organizing is critical to stop these pipelines, to protect our lands, but also how building these communities that are strong and that are resilient and that are connected is even stronger than just stopping pipelines. And I think that is how I will leave it. And yeah, just again, thanks everybody for being here and for speaking today.
Thank you, Allie. That was beautiful. And the roots that are formed, not only the relationships, but the roots in our communities that are formed on these fights is, I think, something that we're going to see over the years is going to continue to have impacts. So thank you for everything you're doing. And some of the best food I've eaten was in the homes of Oregon landowners. So I can attest to the good sharing of meals that happens along the Jordan Cove pipeline route. Our last speaker is a funder, Annie, who works with the Equation Campaign. And the great thing about the pipeline fights, and something that sometimes when we talk about lessons, we don't immediately talk about, but from an organization who started fighting pipelines with no money to fight pipelines, and then we started with only $2,000 a month to fight the massive Keystone XL. One of the key lessons and key strategies to have winning campaigns against pipelines is that you have funders who are committed to not only funding the national green groups, and that has to happen because the expertise that they helped us on the ground was absolutely key in all of our pipeline fights, But the real key, and the thing that wasn't funded very often in the beginning of the Keystone XL fight, is funding the grassroots, is funding the frontline communities, funding the people who fuel the movements that beat the pipelines. That is not often the top of the list of a lot of the larger foundations. And then comes in groups like the Equation Campaign, who are committed, their sole purpose and mission is committed to funding movements to keep fossil fuels in the grounds. So we wanted to make sure, as part of our kind of panelists of key lessons that have stopped pipelines, that we also included a funder because they were so key in all of our fights in order to win. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Annie.
Thank you, Jane, and what an honor to be speaking in the same virtual room as everyone who we just heard from. It is the honor and privilege of my lifetime and everyone on the Equation Campaign team to be able to support the kind of work that we're hearing about tonight. So as Jane mentioned, the Equation Campaign is a recently started funding initiative whose sole focus is funding frontline resistance to oil and gas build out. We fund movements on the ground to keep fossil fuels in the ground. And we do this not only because it's an investment in economic justice, in racial justice, in reversing harms that have been existing for centuries, decades, but it's also because it's the most effective strategy to stop the expansion of oil and gas, which is a direct threat to our livelihoods, to lives all over the planet. Oil and gas expansion is fundamentally incompatible with a 1.5 degree pathway and is a direct path to climate catastrophe. But you don't just have to take my word for it. The industry itself has said the number one obstacle to building out their projects is local resistance, and you can see why they're scared, and you can hear why they're scared from stories that Justin and Richard and Allie have told. When things are driven by lived experience, you can see how powerful the wins can be. Everything you've heard tonight is every reason why we invest in the front lines. We can't win the climate fight if we're not coming up against the industry directly, and we can't do that without talking about the lived experience and the expertise of people whose lives are on the line. We can learn what we need to know and model from these activists and their comrades. If fights are driven by love and lived experience, they can win. If we care as much about human lives and justice as we do about profit, if not more so, we can win. And if we refuse to settle for scraps and demand that our water be clean and that our children can breathe and that we don't depend on poison to be our livelihoods, we can win. To know this work and to hear about it from the folks on the front lines is to find the continued extraction of fossil fuels absolutely intolerable. We all have skin in the game, like we heard tonight, and we need to start investing in backing these folks up. Now, despite the fact that these individuals you just heard from and so many more have led incredibly important campaigns and secured amazing victories, the reality is that less than 2% of all philanthropic dollars make it to the front lines, and just 1.3% of philanthropic dollars make it to Black, Indigenous, and POC-led orgs. Most of what you said, while Jane shouted out funders, the reality is a lot of what was done, that was spoken about tonight, was done on a shoestring. Now imagine what folks could do if they were meaningfully and responsibly supported with, and money wasn't the reason that anybody was limited. While we do have the privilege of hearing from folks who have secured these victories, I don't want to paint an overly rosy picture of what we're up against. Someone mentioned Line 3 tonight, and it was announced today that despite ongoing resistance for years, oil is going to start flowing in Line 3 on Friday. This is heartbreaking. And if you know the folks on the front lines, your heart is breaking along with ours. This is, again, not a reason to feel like it wasn't smart to support them, and not a reason to go all in with these folks who are putting their lives and their bodies and their time on the line. Despite the fact that the oil is going to start to flow, there's a myriad of wins that we could not have secured without the brave fighting of folks at Line 3. It was delayed by 4 years. This cost corporations a ton of money. Shell and the Koch brothers pulled out of funding. It's having other folks run scared. Penn East was canceled this week, So I just want to shout out to our relatives over there. And remember that it's all bittersweet, but the more we can join hands with people at the front lines, with organizers, with strong, fearless resistance, the better off we're going to be. I want to say thank you so much to every single person who spoke tonight and all your families and everyone who fought with you. We couldn't be where we are today without you. And I hope everyone tonight is taking things home with them, learning from these folks and thinking about ways we can link arms. I'm going to turn it back over to the experts tonight for a little bit of Q&A, but thank you all. And for anyone who has questions, I'm here. Back over to you.
Thank you, Annie. And thank you for bringing your heart to this work and to so many of your colleagues, especially Katie Redford. Shout out to Katie, who has traveled to so many of our states, and Kenny Bruno, who was kind of a grassroots organizer who coordinated a lot of the funders, in particular for Keystone XL and some of the other pipeline fights in the early days. We literally would not be an organization without groups like the Equation Campaign and individuals who lived the grassroots organizing experience and then went on the other side of the fence to the funder world, like Katie and Kenny, who advocate for us in those rooms that none of us are in. So I am going to turn the mic now over to Mark, who is going to facilitate some questions. We promised folks that we would be off at 7:30, so we have 10 minutes for questions. So I'll turn it over to Mark.
Everybody, thanks, Jane. Thanks, everyone. This is a really amazing presentation. Just want to point out real quick, it's 2 days after the anniversary, but behind me, if you might notice, is the concert poster from the Harvest the Hope concert. Neil Young and Willie Nelson's John Hancock's on there. Also happen to be wearing the concert t-shirt from the concert. Had some amazing artwork designed from this by our designer, Justin Kimmerling. These machines stop pipelines. It's a riff on the old Woody Guthrie line. These machines kill fascists, stop fascists. In any case, we do have a couple questions here, and we had a couple that came in, and if anyone's on the phone, we'll just go through the ones that are were answered online. Susan asks, do you know the current progress and or fight with the Sable Trail pipeline, also owned by Enbridge, like Line 3? And the reply came through, Sable Trail did come online in 2017, and they're currently looking to expand with some new compressor stations. And they asked for a 2-year extension, was the latest news that I could find on that. Another question from Susan was, were there issues during the Keystone fight with police being on their side of the pipeline company, like in Minnesota with Line 3? I'll let Joy answer as well, but I put a link in the Q&A to a blog post. Bold actually FOIA'd to find out about this back in 2013. This is kind of the earliest that we know of indication that, in fact, yes, the pipeline company was colluding with the FBI, these fusion centers, as they call them, and was very helpfully suggesting to the FBI that there could be statutes that they could prosecute ranchers for terrorism, for not wanting surveyors to come on their land, and for being aggressive, quote, this is what the pipeline company called them, these very senior folks who just didn't want folks coming on their land to survey, and certainly didn't want a pipeline. Joy, if you want to add to that, be my guest.
Yeah, and then they also came up and helped write, like actually help write anti-protest laws in South Dakota. And right along my reservation boundaries, definitely Hawken County and a couple of the other counties, Pennington County, came after pipeline fighters, water protectors. And we have 2 water protectors that face charges. Jason Charger, who is now off of probation. She finished her 6 months. She's already gone through the court system with regards to locking down on equipment. And then Oscar High Elk is facing up to 10 years in prison, all for speaking Lakota, our language, saying that he's from Ocheti Shakoi, which is what we call this land, and to a non-native woman rancher. And she got scared because he was speaking Lakota, and she gave some tears, and now he's facing up to 10 years for free speech on a public road and speaking Lakota and practicing our Lakota Native religious ceremonies that was happening during the Bigfoot ride. So look forward to that hearing is coming up in January. We don't know the exact date. The judge hasn't given us an answer to that. So yes, the police definitely. And there was a little incident with the National Guard at one point, 2012. Yeah. So I'll just leave that at that. I was there.
Thanks, Joy. Yeah, and the topic of this and the ongoing issues with police and racist policies and what's going on in this country. I was talking with another when Bold was involved with the Dapple fight in Iowa and was supporting some landowners down there. It was largely white folks were involved in the direct actions, and I'll just say the treatment was very different in some of the counties in Iowa as opposed to what happened at Standing Rock and some of the other things that we've seen. So it's very much an ongoing issue, and we're seeing this with all the laws, like Joy mentioned, that they're trying to enact against peaceful protests, essentially, and folks trying to protect their water. So another question, unless anyone else wants to jump in on that, I'll give it a second. Hearing none. Susan had another question. What's the best way to get involved right now? She's in Nebraska. We will potentially be having a CO2 pipeline fight coming through Nebraska. Jen can talk about that. But also there's folks still on the front lines of Line 3, and I put some links in the chat if you want to get directly involved. There's still opportunities to do that in the very near future here. But I think that the folks up there definitely have just been, this past summer has been insane, and Jane was up there and she can talk about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, so on the carbon pipelines, we are going to start holding landowner organizing meetings on carbon pipelines in mid-October, using the same model we did with Keystone XL with the Nebraska easement action teams, where we have legal representation for landowners who want to oppose those pipelines. Plus, there's just a ton of education we're doing for ourselves, as well as we're going to have to hold a ton of education sessions, just like we did on tar sands, on the risks of these carbon pipelines, since the pipeline companies now want to pretend that they are the big green champions, and that these pipelines are somehow going to be the magic solution to all of the world's problems, when we know that it's just going to be an extension to keep fossil fuel companies alive and kicking, while having taxpayers foot the bill for all the subsidies to pay for them. So, I think the most important thing, if you want to stay involved in pipeline fights, is to support all the different frontline groups that spoke tonight. We linked to a lot of these groups on pipelinefighters.org. We created Pipeline Fighters so folks could kind of know about all the different pipeline fights. And then I'll also just take this opportunity, and then I'll throw it to fellow panelists, to say, there's three big things that we're going to continue to fight for on Bold. One is we absolutely believe that we need not only state, but federal laws to end eminent domain for private gain. So that is a key policy fight. The second one is standing shoulder to shoulder with tribal nations to make sure that their treaty and sovereign rights are actually respected in the federal process and in the state process, which they're absolutely not right now. And then the third would be better zoning. So if you're thinking about running for office, I know Congress and legislature are often the popular things, but your county commission is where the action is at. That's where all the zoning happens. That's where road haul agreements, that's where police agreements happen. And that's not only for pipelines, that's true for clean energy. So if landowners and tribes are actually going to be part of the wealth creation for the clean energy revolution, there has to be better zoning and better landowner and land use agreements, and that often happens at the county level. So we're going to continue to be involved in that. So if that interests you, certainly stay engaged with the Pipeline Fighters Hub.
Thanks, Jane. We have time. I think this is going to potentially cut us off in 2 minutes, but Richard said he wanted to speak on MVP, so I'll give you a minute, and we have maybe one more question.
Yeah, I'll just be super quick. But to the question of where can we get involved, I want to comment that the Mountain Valley Pipeline is at a very critical juncture right now. It's a tipping point. They've done extraordinary damage to the land, but they don't have the pipe in the ground for more than 50% of the distance, even though they often say they're 85% complete. That's garbage. And I would say that the people in the communities around the Mountain Valley Pipeline, they're exhausted. They've been fighting for as long as we did on the ACP, plus a year. And they're leaning on the folks from the ACP to try to help them. But as you can imagine, people who just finished 6 years of fighting, it's hard to get some of that energy. But we're trying all the time. But to anyone who has help, opportunity, support, the Mountain Valley Pipeline can really use you right now. And we can beat this pipeline too. It is every bit unjust as the ACP and all of the other ones we've talked about. And they've been much harder and more negligent with the environmental issues, but this is the time. So if you've got the opportunity to lean in anywhere, the Mountain Valley Pipeline is a place that could really use you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Richard. It has not cut us off, so I think this is a pretty good place. I just wanted to mention one thing. A couple folks have mentioned one of the pipeline fighters on DEPL in Iowa, Jessica, who is now she's been convicted and very escalated terrorism charges, which should not apply to anyone who's doing this kind of work. And I don't know if I have a link handy, but in the follow-up email can include some information on that. And also, if you subscribe to Extracted, I put that in the link. I've been following the petitions and whatnot that folks have put out to try and at least remedy the charges that she was convicted of, which included terrorism charges on Dakota Access. If anyone else has any final remarks, I'll open it up to the panel. But otherwise, thanks, everyone.
I'll say one thing, and then I'll just throw it to everybody if they want to go down the road, saying just a few kind of final sign off. The pipelines that we're fighting right now, there's lots of smaller kind of interstate pipelines down in Texas and Louisiana. I don't want to have a pipeline fighters briefing where we don't acknowledge that in Louisiana and Texas, they are facing the brunt of not only the climate crisis with flooding, et cetera, and hurricanes, but they also are the ones that are fighting every single day with another pipeline and another fracked gas project threatening their land and community. So there were some questions about Line 5. So Governor Whitmer is really standing strong against Line 5, and President Biden needs to back her up. So that is still a live and active fight, and folks on the ground are doing everything they possibly can to make sure that she has the support. So Line 5, Mountain Valley Pipeline are two critical ones that we're currently fighting. Unfortunately, Line 3 looks like it will go online, but that will be right in the direction of Dakota Access Pipeline, where President Biden can demand that the Army Corps issues a stay on those pipelines with the flow of oil, because neither one of them had a proper environmental study done. And then Jordan Cove, fingers crossed, Allie, those final nail in the coffin is happening. And so we'll be able to, I essentially say we'll be able to add a lot more Davids in the column versus the Goliaths. And lastly, on Line 3, so many of us have deep relationships with Winona and Tara and so many of the pipeline fighters and water protectors there. And it is not only heartbreaking, but I also want to lift up the fight that they've done. And Richard talked about this. If it wasn't for the fight in Line 3, I don't know if Penn East would have been canceled, or Keystone XL, or so many of the other pipeline fights, ACP. And the reality is, when we first learned about tar sands, they wanted to build 10 tar sands pipelines across the United States. They got one, the southern leg of Keystone XL. They have Line 3. That will be the last tar sands pipeline that is built from Canada to the export market through the United States. So if it wasn't for the resistance of folks on Line 3, and of course of Keystone XL, there'd be 10 tar sands pipelines across the United States. So we have a lot to celebrate in the fight of Line 3. It's disgusting that President Biden is allowing a pipeline that will put just as much carbon emissions as 50 coal plants every single year, and that pipeline could be in service for up to 50 years or more. So that has to stop. but it's also going to be the last tar sands pipeline that's ever built in the United States. And that's because of Winona, Tara, and so many of the other folks on the front line.
And I'll just reiterate this. Those are my friends, those are my relatives, those are my Anishinaabe relatives that heeded the call and heard the call and came to Standing Rock. It's not the first time I've seen Tara take rubber bullets. It's not the first time her and I have eaten tear gas together. But I think of Simone, and I think of Dawn, and I think of Tasha, and all the power that they put into the earth and into the water. Those prayers will be answered eventually. Just like I know DAPA will be stopped eventually. And Enbridge will be stopped eventually. We're taking them out one bit at a time. We're stopping them one bit at a time. And it's high time, you know, that Biden and the rest of these people up there in Washington, D.C. hear us and realize that we are not your sacrifice. I am not your lamb to be sacrificed. We are all Americans. You made us Americans, us Native Americans in 1924, and we couldn't even vote. Now I get to vote. And my vote did not vote for fossil fuels. So come and join us in Washington, D.C. in People versus Fossil Fuels. If you can't join us, look for a solidarity action, but join us online. Join us in Washington, D.C. I know it's a big ask to do. I know it's a big ask to do. But come and join us, because I'll be there. Nose holes and all. This is my remnant from DAPL. But they won't win. They won't win.
Thank you, everyone. I just want to say good night. We'll continue to send resources through the email list to sign up for Extracted. Stay in touch with all the pipeline fighters. The only way we beat these pipelines is for the people closest to that pain to be the ones that are providing the solutions. And that's what everybody here tonight's doing. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.